History doesn't whisper its darkest moments, it screams them through the centuries. Imagine standing in a crowded square, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of strangers, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and something far worse. The crowd isn't there for justice. They're there for a show. A performance of pain, where the state turns suffering into spectacle, and fear into obedience. For most of history, executions weren't hidden behind prison walls. They were public rituals, designed to remind every witness who truly held power. Kings, queens, emperors, popes, all wielded the ultimate weapon, not just the right to kill, but the right to make death last. To make it mean something. From England's medieval traders to China's death by 1,000 cuts, from Florence's burning prophets to France's tortured regicides, every society found its own way to turn punishment into theater. But here's the paradox: every time cruelty reached its peak, humanity seemed to recoil. Crowds who came to cheer often left in silence, haunted by what they had witnessed. Some fainted. Some vomited. And some began to question whether the spectacle of justice had become a reflection of something much darker, us. These are not just tales of execution, they're case studies in power, how it controls, humiliates, and sometimes destroys itself. Because in the end, every scream, every broken body, and every public death forced the world one step closer to asking a question it still struggles with today: can justice exist without cruelty? They came not for justice, but for the show. It's hard to imagine now, the idea that punishment was once the most anticipated form of public entertainment. But for centuries, from London to Paris, Beijing to Florence, the execution square was the theater of the state. A place where power didn't just speak, it performed. Picture it, a chill morning mist settling over cobblestones darkened by years of spilled blood. Vendors sell hot bread and wine while families stake out good spots near the scaffold. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders, nobles lean from windows draped in silk. The crowd buzzes with energy, not fear, at least not yet. Because before the screams, there is always anticipation. This was how authority sustained itself, through the ritual of terror. A sovereign could order a man's death, but only a public death could remind every subject who truly ruled their body and soul. The execution wasn't merely the end of life, it was a message carved into flesh, a warning to the living. And that message, repeated for centuries, was simple: power owns you. It decides how much you can suffer. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't confined to courts or prisons. It unfolded on platforms built high enough for the crowd to see every detail. The condemned stood before thousands, stripped of titles, stripped of dignity, and often, stripped of hope long before the blade fell. The line between punishment and spectacle vanished quickly. Monarchs, judges, and priests understood that the spectacle itself was part of the control mechanism. People had to see justice being done, and they had to feel it in their bones. Every gasp, every cry, every drop of blood fed a shared illusion: that order required suffering. Yet, for all its grandeur, there was something fragile in this display. Because in every audience, amid the jeers and prayers, someone always turned away. Someone fainted. Someone vomited. Someone realized that the justice before them didn't cleanse the world, it stained it. The public execution was an elaborate choreography. It had its own rhythm, its own symbolism, its own hierarchy of pain. When the condemned arrived, the ceremony began long before the killing blow. The reading of charges, the procession through the streets, the taunts of the crowd, all of it served to reduce a person into a lesson. The body became a blackboard, and punishment became the handwriting of kings. Different crimes demanded different scripts. A thief might hang, a heretic might burn, a traitor might be torn apart, each method chosen to echo the moral gravity of the offense. There was a strange logic to it: the punishment had to fit the crime, but more importantly, it had to fit the narrative. In England, traitors were drawn and quartered, dragged through the mud before being disemboweled and dismembered. In China, lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts, turned execution into bureaucratic torture, with the number of incisions carefully prescribed by law. In France, a man who attacked the king was torn apart by horses, each limb pulled toward a different horizon as the crowd watched in horrified fascination. These were not crimes being punished, these were stories being told. Each execution reinforced the myth of divine authority, that kings ruled by God's will, that disobedience was sin, and that rebellion deserved more than death, it deserved spectacle. We often imagine the spectators as passive, horrified, detached, powerless. But they were part of the system. Their presence completed the ritual. To witness was to validate. Their cheers were a chorus of consent, their silence, an admission of complicity. They were meant to internalize the fear, to carry it home, to teach their children that the state could break any body, at any time. And yet, within those same crowds, something began to shift. The human reaction to horror isn't predictable. Some spectators laughed, others wept. Some prayed for mercy, others demanded more pain. The deeper the cruelty, the greater the unease that spread through the masses, a quiet realization that what they were seeing was not justice at all, but the reflection of their rulers' insecurity. It was in these moments, the pale faces, the trembling hands, the averted gazes, that civilization began to evolve. Because once people recognized that the performance was not righteous but grotesque, the performance started to lose its power. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had turned execution into a kind of public festival. Posters announced dates and locations. Taverns filled with gossip about the condemned. Poets wrote verses describing the deaths in exquisite detail. The line between punishment and entertainment blurred until it disappeared. The irony was that the more public and dramatic the executions became, the less effective they were as tools of control. When crowds began fainting instead of cheering, when mothers shielded their children's eyes, and when nobles whispered that the king's cruelty was shameful, something began to fracture in the moral armor of authority. The state had made an art of pain, but it was an art that eventually condemned its creators. Because cruelty, once performed, cannot be contained. It spreads, through rumor, through conscience, through history itself. Every act of spectacular violence plants a seed of rebellion. The onlookers leave changed, not just terrified, but haunted. Power always seeks permanence. But history shows that the more it tries to immortalize itself through terror, the faster it erodes. Every ruler who used pain as propaganda believed it would preserve order. Yet, in case after case, these brutal displays did the opposite. They transformed the condemned into martyrs, and kings into villains. The crowd that came to obey left questioning everything. In London, a traitor's body parts displayed on city gates became symbols of tyranny. In Florence, a preacher's ashes thrown into the river turned into whispers of sainthood. In France, a man torn apart for attacking the king inspired philosophers to write about human rights. Violence once justified by faith and law became a mirror reflecting the very things societies claimed to fear: chaos, cruelty, the loss of humanity itself. We like to think we've moved beyond it, that we've outgrown the hunger for spectacle. But every time a story of cruelty goes viral, every time pain becomes a headline, we echo the same instincts that once filled those medieval squares. The only difference is the stage. The technology has changed, the fascination has not. History's lesson is uncomfortable but necessary: civilization doesn't advance in a straight line. It stumbles forward, haunted by its own reflections. And those 8 deaths, from Dispenser to Ravaillac, stand as milestones not of progress, but of awakening. Each horror carved away a piece of our blindness, forcing humanity to confront what it had become. Because in the end, the history of executions is not the history of criminals. It's the history of us, of what we're willing to accept, of what we're capable of watching, and of how far we'll go before we finally turn away. London, November 24, 1326. The morning air was sharp with cold, the kind that cut through skin and lingered in bone. Crowds filled the muddy streets, pressing against one another in a tide of murmurs and movement. Men stood on barrels for a better view, women clutched their children tightly, and vendors shouted above the noise, selling ale to warm the waiting masses. It was not a day of mourning, it was a day of spectacle. A man who had ruled England from the shadows was about to face his end, and the city had gathered to watch power devour itself. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, and only months before, his influence had seemed untouchable. He was more than a nobleman, he was the king's favorite, the closest confidant of Edward II, and the most hated man in the realm. For years, Despenser had grown rich by exploiting his position, seizing lands, imprisoning rivals, and crushing those who stood in his way. His enemies accused him not only of tyranny but of unnatural sin, a phrase whispered with disgust and fascination in equal measure. Rumors said his closeness to the king was not merely political. To medieval England, that alone was enough to mark him for damnation. When Queen Isabella, Edward's estranged wife, and her lover Roger Mortimer invaded from France, their campaign was swift and merciless. Within weeks, the king's army collapsed. Edward fled, Despenser followed. But fortune does not remain loyal to the cruel. Captured near the Welsh border, Despenser was dragged back to London in chains. There would be no trial, no mercy. The sentence had already been decided, not by law, but by vengeance. That November morning, the scaffold in Hereford was not merely a platform for execution. It was a stage, carefully designed, positioned high enough for thousands to see. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of the instruments prepared for what was to come. The crowd's anticipation was feverish, a mix of righteous fury and morbid curiosity. They had come to witness the fall of a man who had humiliated lords and starved peasants, who had ruled beside the king like a shadow monarch. But they had also come for something darker, the thrill of seeing pain made visible. Despenser was brought forth wearing only a thin tunic. His once proud face was pale, hollowed by days of imprisonment and starvation. On his chest, someone had pinned a piece of parchment inscribed with verses from the Bible, mocking him, reminding all that his sins were not just against men, but against God. As he looked over the crowd, there was no hint of defiance, only a dull awareness that his body no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the performance. The execution began with precision. Despenser was first hanged, but not to death. The rope had been measured so that his body would dangle at the edge of consciousness, his throat crushed just enough to make him gasp and convulse without letting him die. The crowd erupted in noise, shouts, laughter, curses. Some spat at him. Others stared in silence, transfixed by the image of a man suspended between life and death. When he was cut down, the second act began. The executioner, chosen for his skill, moved with practiced calm. A fire had been built beside the scaffold. As the smoke rose, he drew a small, sharpened blade and began to work. In a gesture both symbolic and horrifying, he castrated Despenser, holding the severed flesh aloft before tossing it into the flames. The crowd roared again, the act understood by all as both punishment and statement, retribution for the rumors that had stained the king's court. But the cruelty did not end there. Despenser was laid upon a table, his arms bound, his breathing ragged. The executioner took a larger knife and cut into his abdomen. The incision was deliberate, shallow enough to prolong consciousness, deep enough to release the heat and scent of living flesh. Witnesses later said the smell was unbearable, a mix of blood, bile, and burning meat from the nearby fire. Some fainted. Some fled. Yet most stayed, unable to look away. As his intestines were drawn slowly from his body and thrown into the flames one by one, Despenser's eyes followed them. The executioner spoke softly, describing each step as he worked, turning the process into a kind of narration, a grotesque litany of punishment. Each word carved deeper into Despenser's psyche than the blade itself. He gasped for air, his lips trembling in silent prayer or perhaps disbelief that a man could endure such agony and still be alive. Hours passed. The rhythm of the spectacle slowed. The fire burned low, the crowd grew quieter. The screams had turned hoarse, the body slackening but not yet dead. Finally, when even the executioner seemed exhausted, the last act arrived. With one final movement, he reached into the gaping wound and cut out Despenser's heart. Holding it high for all to see, he declared, behold the heart of a traitor. Then, almost mercifully, he ended the ritual by severing the head from the corpse. The body was quartered, each piece sent to a different city as a warning. The head, blackened with soot and blood, was taken to London Bridge and displayed upon a pike. As the crowd dispersed, the noise faded into uneasy silence. Witnesses would later write that even those who had called for his death left shaken. The stench of burned flesh hung in the air long after the body was gone. The bonfires dimmed, the square emptied, and yet something invisible remained, a sense that a line had been crossed. What they had seen was not justice. It was vengeance, wearing the mask of law. In the days that followed, stories of the execution spread across England. Some told them with satisfaction, others whispered them in horror. Chroniclers wrote of how even hardened soldiers wept. The brutality of Despenser's death was meant to terrify traitors, but it accomplished something else entirely: it terrified everyone. The punishment had gone so far beyond retribution that it became a mirror of the cruelty it claimed to avenge. In time, the method used on Despenser would become formalized into England's most infamous sentence: hanged, drawn, and quartered. Yet even that phrase could never capture the experience of those who witnessed its first full performance. For the crowd, it was a day when they learned that justice could turn into spectacle, and spectacle into madness. For history, it marked a turning point. It revealed a truth too few dared to admit, that power, when threatened, will always find a way to make pain holy. Despenser's death became legend, passed down in chronicles and sermons as both warning and confession. To some, it was proof that tyranny never goes unpunished. To others, it was evidence that no system of power is immune to its own corruption. The scaffolds of medieval England would rise again and again in the centuries that followed, but each time, the echo of that November morning remained. The fog, the fire, the screams, they were reminders of how easily justice could lose its soul. And so, in the chill of that dawn, amid the cheers that faded into silence, the world glimpsed a truth that would haunt it for generations: that cruelty, once sanctified by law, becomes the most dangerous religion of all. Beijing, late 19th century. The city was alive with sound, vendors shouting, carts rattling over stone streets, temple bells tolling faintly in the distance, yet beneath the surface hum of daily life, there was tension. A name had spread through the alleys and tea houses: Fu Tue, a man condemned for the unthinkable. He had murdered his own family in a fit of madness and rage. In the eyes of the Qing dynasty's law, that was not simply murder, it was the ultimate violation of moral order. His punishment would be the most severe form of death ever devised by the imperial system, Ling Chi, known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts. This was not execution in the ordinary sense. It was a ritual. A performance of law so meticulously choreographed that even cruelty had its own bureaucracy. The decree had been signed by imperial order, and on the morning of the execution, the city began to gather as if for a festival. Banners were hung, guards cleared a public square. The condemned was brought out, paraded through the streets in a wooden collar that bit into his neck. On his chest hung a placard naming his crimes, written in black ink: parricide, mass murder, rebellion against the natural order. Citizens leaned out of windows, threw refuse, shouted curses, or simply stared in grim fascination. For 3 days he had been denied rest. Food was withheld, water given only in sips. The punishment had already begun long before the knife ever touched his skin. By the time he reached the execution platform, Fu Tue was more ghost than man, gaunt, trembling, eyes sunken but alive. He had been told, perhaps truthfully, that confession might earn him a quicker end. Yet confession in Lingqi was not about truth. It was about submission, the surrender of self to the machine of justice. The crowd surrounded the wooden pole where he would be tied. Guards looped thick ropes around his arms and legs, spreading them wide so that he could not move even an inch. The platform was raised slightly, so everyone could see. Beside it stood the executioner, a middle-aged man dressed in faded blue robes. He was not a sadist. He was a professional, trained through years of apprenticeship, responsible for performing his duty precisely according to law. On a low table beside him rested a roll of linen cloth, a bowl of water, and a set of knives. Each blade was polished, narrow, and terrifyingly sharp. When the gong sounded, the square fell silent. The executioner stepped forward and began with the first cut. It was small, a shallow slice along the arm, just enough to draw blood. Fu Tui screamed, the sound piercing and raw, echoing across the square. The second cut followed, then a third, then a fourth. Each stroke was deliberate. The law dictated that the punishment must proceed in stages: arms, legs, chest, back, face, genitals, each cut calculated to prolong life without causing death too soon. Foreign observers who witnessed Ling Chi in those years described the sound as something beyond human, a scream that stripped away language itself. It wasn't pain alone, it was disbelief that a person could still exist in such a state. The crowd reacted in waves. Some men shouted for mercy, others cursed his crimes. Women covered their eyes. Yet few turned away completely. They were compelled to look, as if watching affirmed that order still existed, that this horror was somehow necessary. Between each series of cuts, the executioner paused to let the condemned breathe, to keep him conscious. A servant occasionally offered the man water. Sometimes, a pinch of opium was given, not out of compassion but to ensure that the victim would not faint before the ritual was complete. This was the paradox of Ling Chi, mercy used in the service of cruelty. Hours passed. The pile of blood-soaked cloths at the executioner's feet grew higher. The man's body became less recognizable, a map of open wounds, a study in anatomy and endurance. His chest rose and fell in shallow jerks, his eyes rolled but still saw. The executioner moved like a surgeon, not rushing, not hesitating. He was following the manual, performing not murder but procedure. To deviate from the prescribed number of cuts would mean punishment for him as well. In the bureaucracy of the empire, even agony had a quota. By the end of the first day, the condemned was barely conscious. His mouth opened soundlessly. His body hung from the ropes like wet cloth. The crowd had thinned, many fleeing the smell, a heavy, metallic stench of blood and sweat and burning incense. Yet those who stayed described something unexpected, a quiet reverence. The spectacle had ceased to be entertainment. It had become a kind of communion between power and mortality. In that moment, they were all participants in a ritual older than reason, the belief that suffering could purify, that pain could restore order to the world. According to witnesses, the execution continued into the second day. No one could say exactly how many cuts were made, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands. The law allowed discretion, minor offenses warranted 100 cuts before the mercy stroke, while the gravest demanded 3,000. Fu Tui's sentence had no mercy written into it. Some said he lived until the final cut to his throat, others claimed the executioner, moved by pity, ended it sooner. The truth was lost in the noise of centuries. When it was finally over, the square was nearly empty. The body, or what remained of it, was placed on display. Later, the remains were burned, and the ashes scattered outside the city walls. The knives were cleaned, the record signed, the executioner's duty complete. For the imperial authorities, justice had been served. The report submitted to the governor contained only numbers, date, name, crime, number of cuts, time of death. A human life reduced to a bureaucratic entry, efficient, precise, terrifyingly ordinary. But history remembers differently. Photographs taken in the late Qing period show the final stages of Ling Chi, haunting images that scholars still debate today. Some call them evidence of barbarism, others see in them the reflection of a universal truth, that every civilization, when consumed by fear of disorder, eventually learns to rationalize cruelty. To Westerners who saw the practice, Ling Chi became a symbol of Oriental cruelty. Newspapers and missionaries described it as proof of China's backwardness, ignoring the fact that Europe had its own theaters of torment, breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering. The horror was not uniquely Chinese. It was human. It was what happens when the state believes that control requires pain, when justice becomes performance. In 1905, lynching was abolished as part of legal reforms meant to modernize the empire. But the memory of it lingered, carried in photographs, diaries, and the nightmares of those who had seen it. The executioners who performed it often lived in isolation, regarded with a strange mix of fear and respect. Many reportedly retired to the countryside, their hands shaking years later as if the echoes of those screams had taken root in their bones. Fu Tui's death, like so many others before him, revealed the deepest paradox of human power, the belief that by mastering pain, we can master fear. Yet, in truth, every cut inflicted upon the condemned also wounded the society that demanded it. The people who watched carried that scar forward, passing it through generations until it became something intangible, a shadow on collective memory. In the end, the story of lynching is not about a single man's suffering. It is about the perfection of cruelty, how a civilization, at the height of its order and sophistication, could transform punishment into a science. It is about the illusion that precision can make barbarity acceptable, that procedure can sanitize horror. And above all, it is about the moment when the crowd, faced with the unbearable, begins to understand that justice without compassion is not justice at all. Long after the knives were cleaned and the law abolished, the echo of those 1,000 cuts remained, a silent warning etched into the history of human power. London, April 1531. The smell of wet earth and smoke clung to the city as dawn crept over Smithfield, the open square that had seen more death than any churchyard in England. The crowd gathered early, drawn not by curiosity alone but by fear and fascination. A new kind of execution was about to take place, one that even seasoned soldiers and executioners whispered about with unease. At the center of it all stood a massive iron cauldron, blackened by soot and suspended above a pile of wood. The air was thick with expectation. A man named Richard Roos was about to be boiled alive. Just weeks before, Roos had been an ordinary cook in the household of the Bishop of Rochester. He was known as cheerful, dependable, perhaps a bit simple-minded, a man trusted to prepare meals for nobles and servants alike. But one February afternoon, a pot of porridge he had prepared became an instrument of horror. 17 people fell violently ill, writhing in agony, 2 of them died. Rumors of poisoning spread like fire. The age of Henry VIII was one of paranoia, and the king, haunted by the thought of assassination by poison, declared the act not mere murder, but treason. Roos's guilt was never proven beyond doubt. Some said he confessed under torture, claiming he meant only to play a prank that went wrong. Others swore he maintained his innocence to the end, insisting that someone else had tampered with the food to frame him. It didn't matter. The law was written for the living, but justice was often scripted for the audience. Henry wanted an example so shocking that no one would dare attempt such a crime again. Parliament hastily passed the Act for Poisoning, declaring that all poisoners should suffer death by boiling. No one had ever seen it done before. That morning, as the condemned was led into the square, witnesses said his legs gave out beneath him. He was carried to the scaffold, pale and trembling, his eyes darting wildly between the executioners and the enormous cauldron that awaited him. The pot was already filled with water, and the fire beneath it had been lit hours earlier. Flames licked the iron belly, sending steam hissing into the cold air. Roos's lips moved in prayer, though no words could be heard above the rising murmur of the crowd. The executioner, his face hidden beneath a leather hood, waited for the signal. A royal official stepped forward, unrolling a parchment and reading the charges in a clear, steady voice. The words echoed through the square: treason against the King's Majesty, by means of poison. When he finished, he nodded. The executioner seized the condemned man and forced him toward the cauldron. Accounts differ on whether the water was already boiling or only warm when Roos was submerged. Some said he was lowered slowly, screaming as the heat seared his skin, while others claimed he was dropped suddenly into water that had not yet reached a boil, condemned to feel the temperature rise degree by degree. Either way, the result was the same: agony turned into spectacle. The crowd, expecting swift justice, was met instead with something drawn out and dreadful. At first, there was silence. Then came a sound, half scream, half gurgle, as Rusa's body thrashed against the iron rim. Steam rose in great white clouds, carrying with it a sweet, nauseating scent that onlookers would never forget. The fire roared louder, fed by attendants who piled wood beneath the pot, ensuring that the water never cooled. Witnesses later wrote that the smell was like roasting meat, but with a strange, sickly undertone that turned stomachs. Even those accustomed to the gore of public hangings found themselves reeling. Children were pulled away, women fainted, men turned their faces from the sight. Yet, some stayed. They watched through the haze of steam, unable to look away, as Rusa's skin blistered and peeled, his screams weakening into hoarse gasps. His body was lifted briefly by hooks, only to be dropped again, prolonging the suffering. The execution lasted nearly 2 hours before he finally fell silent. When it was over, the crowd did not cheer. There was no triumph, no sense of justice served. Only a stunned quiet. The king's messenger proclaimed that England had been purged of a traitor, but few believed it. Even the executioners were shaken. The boiling law had done what it set out to do, terrify the people, but it also revealed something about the nature of power, that fear, once unleashed, cannot be easily controlled. In the weeks that followed, word of Rusa's death spread across the kingdom. Some celebrated it as righteous punishment, others whispered that it was an abomination, a sin against mercy itself. Chroniclers recorded that the usual carnival atmosphere of execution day was absent. No songs, no laughter, no shouts of approval, only silence and the memory of steam rising like the breath of hell. For 16 years, the law remained on England's books. At least one other person, a maid accused of poisoning her mistress, was boiled alive under its terms. But even in a time when public torture was accepted, the punishment was too much. It disturbed the very people it was meant to reassure. Executioners complained that the task broke their spirit. Guards asked to be reassigned. And ordinary citizens began to question whether justice that made them sick to their stomachs could still be called justice at all. When the law was quietly repealed in 1547, no official reason was recorded. Perhaps none was needed. Everyone already understood. The horror had spoken for itself. Yet the story of Richard Roos did not fade entirely. Historians would later revisit it as a symbol of a king's paranoia, Henry VIII, so obsessed with betrayal that he turned justice into theater. But the story also became something deeper, a reminder of how quickly moral certainty can slip into cruelty when driven by fear. The boiling pot, in all its grotesque symbolism, was more than punishment. It was a mirror. For those who witnessed it, the memory of that day remained vivid. One chronicle describes a merchant who had stood near the front of the crowd. For years afterward, he claimed to still smell the steam when it rained. Another told of a soldier who had laughed during the execution but woke screaming from nightmares for months. The trauma of the event rippled outward, reshaping the boundaries of what even a brutal society could tolerate. And that, perhaps, was the only good that came of it. In trying to demonstrate absolute power, the crown had stumbled upon an unspoken limit, a place where the spectacle of pain ceased to control and began instead to disgust. The act meant to instill obedience instead inspired reflection. It made England question not only its laws, but its conscience. From that day on, the cauldron at Smithfield stood empty. The iron rusted, the wood rotted away, and the site was eventually cleared for markets and fairs. Yet beneath the cobblestones, the ground remembered. Centuries later, historians digging through the records would find the king's order written in confident script, declaring that poisoners should be boiled to death in water or lead or oil. It was the language of certainty, of divine right. But history would remember it differently, as proof that when justice burns too hot, it consumes the hand that wields it. Richard Roos died screaming in a cauldron that day, but the echo of his death was quieter, subtler, and far more lasting. It whispered through generations that power, unchecked by mercy, always finds new ways to boil the innocent along with the guilty. And when the steam finally clears, what remains is not order, but shame. Paris, April 2, 1757. The chill of early spring lingered in the air, but the city was burning with anticipation. For weeks, the name Robert François Damiens had dominated every tavern, every salon, every sermon. He was the man who had dared to strike the body of a king, not just any king, but Louis XV, the so-called beloved. The wound he inflicted was small, barely more than a scratch, but in the eyes of France, it was a wound to the divine itself. An attack on the monarch was an attack on God's order, and the punishment would have to reflect that cosmic crime. Paris would soon witness an execution so elaborate, so gruesome, that even centuries later, historians would struggle to comprehend how civilization could stage something so monstrous in the name of justice. The square of Place de Grève had been transformed into a theater of horror. Overnight, carpenters had built a massive wooden scaffold in the center. Four horses stood tethered at its corners, their breath steaming in the cold air. Around them, soldiers formed a tight perimeter to hold back the sea of spectators. Nobles filled the balconies of nearby buildings, children perched on rooftops, and thousands of Parisians crowded shoulder to shoulder in the square below. They came not out of malice but of habit. For centuries, executions had been public ceremonies, fusions of law, religion, and spectacle. But what awaited them that morning would break even the hardened sensibilities of the 18th century. Robert Damiens had been in prison for months before this day, interrogated endlessly, tortured repeatedly, and questioned by judges, priests, and inquisitors who refused to believe that he had acted alone. The monarchy needed a conspiracy, a network of enemies, a reason to justify the excessive rage that had consumed Versailles. But Damiens had none to give. He was no revolutionary mastermind, only a disillusioned servant, bitter at his misfortunes and convinced that the king had betrayed the faith. Still, the ritual had to proceed. The king's body, symbolic of divine right, had been violated. The violator's body would therefore be made a message, to France, to Europe, to God himself. At mid-morning, the condemned was led from the dungeon to the scaffold. Damiens was barely recognizable as human. His legs had been crushed during questioning, his flesh scarred from hot irons, yet his eyes remained clear. Witnesses described him as trembling, praying under his breath, half-conscious yet aware of his fate. As he was dragged through the crowd, people craned their necks to see, some crossing themselves, others jeering. The royal decree had ordered the punishment to be carried out in the most exemplary and public manner, so that it may serve as a lesson to all. The first act began with the burning of the hand that had held the knife. Damiens's right hand was thrust into a brazier filled with sulfur and pitch. The flames caught instantly. He screamed, a hoarse, guttural sound that seemed to freeze the air. When the fire consumed his skin, the executioner withdrew the hand, now blackened and twisted, and the crowd exhaled as one, a wave of noise, horror, fascination, and disbelief. But this was only the beginning. Next came the tearing of flesh. Four assistants stepped forward with red-hot pincers, their faces hidden beneath soot-streaked hoods. They began at his chest, clamping and ripping away pieces of skin and muscle. Each wound was immediately filled with molten lead, boiling oil, resin, and burning sulfur, poured from small cauldrons kept nearby. The smell was unbearable, an acrid mixture of burning fat and metal, a scent that lodged itself into memory. The crowd's initial excitement faded. Women fainted. Men turned away. Even soldiers shifted uneasily. Still, the ritual continued. The pain, the fire, the methodical cruelty, all were part of the theater of sovereignty. Each act reaffirmed that the king's power extended beyond life itself, that rebellion would not simply be punished but annihilated. Damiens's body was no longer his own. It had become a symbol, a surface upon which the monarchy carved its fear. After more than an hour of torture, when his body was little more than a ruin of bleeding flesh, the executioners prepared for the final act, the drawing and quartering. The four horses were led closer, harnesses fastened to the prisoner's arms and legs. Damiens was barely conscious. His head lolled forward, his chest rose in shallow spasms. Yet the ritual demanded that he remain alive when the horses began their work. At a signal from the chief executioner, the whips cracked. The horses lunged in opposite directions, hooves slamming against the cobblestones, muscles straining. Damien's body jerked violently but did not come apart. The ropes tightened, stretching his limbs to impossible lengths. Again and again, the drivers urged their horses forward, but the human body, resilient even in agony, refused to yield. After an hour, the executioners conferred, their faces pale with exhaustion. They requested permission to use knives to sever the tendons. The magistrates agreed. What followed was perhaps the most unbearable scene in recorded history. The executioners cut through the joints, slicing tendons and muscle while the horses pulled anew. One by one, the limbs gave way. Witnesses later said that even as his arms and legs were torn away, Damien's lips moved faintly, as if trying to pray. When the final limb was severed, the remains of his torso, still faintly breathing, were thrown onto a pyre and burned. Guards stood by to ensure that every fragment of bone and flesh turned to ash. When the flames finally died, the crowd stood silent. The spectacle had lasted nearly 4 hours. No cheers rose, no cries of vengeance, only the rustle of movement as people began to leave in stunned disbelief. Some vomited in the streets, others wandered away without speaking. The nobles who had purchased balcony seats departed early, covering their faces. Paris had witnessed the death of a man, but also, unknowingly, the death of an era. In the days that followed, pamphlets and letters spread across Europe describing the execution in vivid detail. Philosophers, clerics, and commoners alike recoiled. Voltaire wrote that such cruelty degraded not the condemned but the society that demanded it. The act meant to strengthen royal authority instead exposed its madness. The public had expected justice, what they had seen was the machinery of fear. Within a generation, everything changed. The Enlightenment swept through France, challenging divine right and the legitimacy of torture. Damien's execution became a symbol of the old regime's moral decay, a proof that absolute power, when unchecked, could turn civilization into savagery. Michel Foucault, centuries later, would open his book Discipline and Punish with this very scene, using it to mark the transformation of punishment from spectacle to control, from the body to the mind. What began as an assertion of power ended as its undoing. The excess of cruelty shattered the illusion of justice. It turned execution from a celebration of order into an indictment of tyranny. For those who had watched, the memory lingered like a curse, the smell of burning flesh, the sound of tearing, the silence that followed. In trying to prove its strength, the monarchy had shown its weakness. It revealed that fear cannot sustain faith, that power sustained by pain eventually consumes itself. Within 30 years, the French Revolution would sweep away the throne that had demanded Damien's death. The scaffold would remain, but its purpose would change. No longer the altar of kings, it would become the instrument of the people. Robert François Damiens died in agony that April morning, but in his death, the world began to awaken. His execution did not silence dissent, it gave it voice. It forced Europe to ask a question that no king could answer: how much cruelty can justice endure before it becomes indistinguishable from the crime it punishes? Ancient Rome, the cradle of empire, art, and law, was also the birthplace of some of the most terrifying punishments ever recorded. Among them, one stands apart for its sheer intimacy and horror: flaying, the act of removing a person's skin while they still lived. What began as myth in the legend of Marsyas, the satyr who dared to challenge Apollo to a musical duel, became a grim reality in Rome's long history of spectacle and control. To the ancients, the body was both symbol and lesson. And when a man's skin was stripped away, it was more than execution, it was erasure, the unmaking of his identity, his transformation from human to warning. The myth of Marsyas had long haunted Roman imagination. As the story went, Marsyas found a flute once played by the goddess Athena. When he became skilled enough to challenge Apollo, the god of music, the contest turned from art to blasphemy. Apollo won, of course, and as punishment for his pride, he hung Marsyas from a tree and flayed him alive. In Roman culture, this story was more than legend, it was a moral fable, a reminder that defiance against divine or imperial order demanded suffering so profound that it transcended death itself. That same logic soon governed Roman justice. Flaying became a ritual of domination reserved for enemies of the state, traitors, and those accused of sacrilege. The condemned would be stripped and bound to a post or a tree in the public square. The executioner, trained in anatomy, approached with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a craftsman. It was said that a good executioner could peel a man's skin in perfect sheets, starting from the fingertips and working inward, preserving the life of the condemned for as long as possible. Eyewitness accounts from ancient chroniclers described scenes that chilled even hardened soldiers. The first cuts were small, along the wrists or ankles, where the skin was thinnest. The knife was slid beneath, separating skin from muscle in slow, deliberate motions. The victim's screams began as cries of agony and soon dissolved into animalistic howls. The executioner worked methodically, pausing occasionally to let the man catch his breath, ensuring he would not lose consciousness too soon. The purpose was not speed, but endurance. Every moment was part of the performance. The crowd gathered for these executions not simply for bloodlust but for affirmation, a ritual reassurance that order was being restored. The spectacle of suffering was a moral lesson. As one Roman philosopher wrote, "He who defies the empire defies the flesh itself." In other words, the emperor's power did not stop at life or death, it reached into the very skin that defined a person's existence. The psychological horror of flaying was unlike any other punishment. The victim watched his own body transform before his eyes, saw red muscle and pale sinew where moments before there had been skin. Some, it was said, died not from blood loss but from the unbearable shock of seeing themselves reduced to anatomy. Others survived long enough to witness their own flesh displayed before the crowd, a spectacle that blurred the line between justice and cruelty, punishment and art. In certain cases, the Romans turned the act into a symbol. The skin of the executed might be preserved, tanned, and hung in a temple as an offering to the gods or nailed to a city gate as a warning. There are records of generals flaying captured rebels and using their skin to cover drums, instruments of war made from the bodies of those who defied the empire. The message was unmistakable: rebellion was not only futile but sacrilegious. The body itself would be used to proclaim loyalty to Rome. The sound of flaying was said to be worse than the sight. Chroniclers describe it as a wet, tearing sound, a noise that silenced even the most jaded crowds. The executioners who performed this duty often became outcasts, regarded with both fear and reverence. They were necessary instruments of law but carried the stigma of death wherever they went. Some were said to be haunted by the cries of their victims, unable to sleep without wine or the company of the dead. Flaying was not unique to Rome, but the Romans perfected its theatricality. Their executions were designed to demonstrate control over life, flesh, and meaning itself. Even as art and philosophy flourished, the empire's appetite for spectacle grew. Gladiatorial games, crucifixions, and public tortures all fed the same hunger, the desire to see order affirmed through suffering. For an empire built on conquest, violence became language, and flaying, its purest expression. In Roman art, the myth of Marsyas appeared again and again. Sculptors carved the satyr's tormented body in marble, veins bulging, muscles taut, his face frozen between agony and transcendence. Pain, to them, was beauty, a form of truth. Pain revealed what was hidden beneath the surface. Renaissance artists centuries later would rediscover these motifs, studying the human body with the same fascination, sketching flayed figures in pursuit of anatomical perfection. They called them ecorches, skinned men, never realizing they were resurrecting a tradition born in cruelty. There is one account, recorded by the historian Valerius Maximus, of a Roman governor who ordered the flaying of a corrupt tax collector accused of extortion. His skin, once removed, was stretched across the governor's chair as a reminder to his successor. When asked whether this was justice or vengeance, the governor reportedly replied, "Both." Such was the Roman sense of morality, efficient, pragmatic, and absolute. Yet even in Rome, where cruelty was currency, there were those who recoiled. Philosophers of the Stoic school argued that such punishments degraded not the condemned, but the state itself. To destroy a man's body so that others may fear, wrote Seneca, is to admit that you cannot rule their minds. These words would echo through centuries, though few would listen until it was far too late. The practice of flaying faded gradually with the fall of the empire, replaced by crucifixions, burnings, and other methods less intimate but no less brutal. Still, its shadow lingered. Medieval inquisitors revived the punishment for heretics and witches. In the East, it survived in whispers, used by warlords and kings who sought to make examples of traitors. The memory of Marsyas never truly died, it simply changed names, changed tools, changed faces. In the end, the story of flaying, both myth and history, reveals more about humanity than about punishment. It exposes our fascination with boundaries, between body and soul, justice and cruelty, civilization and savagery. Rome, for all its grandeur, was never more human than in those moments when it stood before the screaming victim, knife in hand, convinced that this act, this horror, was order itself. The lesson endures. Every empire, in its own way, repeats the myth of Marsyas. Each believes itself divine, invincible, beyond reproach, until the blade it wields turns inward. The Romans thought they were honoring the gods. In truth, they were peeling back their own skin, revealing the raw, trembling truth beneath, that power, stripped of mercy, always flays the one who wields it first. Scotland, August 23, 1305. The morning mist clung low over London's rooftops as thousands gathered near Smithfield, the open ground that had become synonymous with public death. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of hay, sweat, and anticipation. Word had spread quickly across the city, the execution of William Wallace, the Scottish rebel who had defied England's King Edward I and humiliated his armies, would take place today. The man who once led a nation to freedom was now a prisoner, and his punishment was to be more than death. It was to be the destruction of a symbol, body, spirit, and legend alike. From the Tower of London, Wallace was dragged through the streets tied to the tail of a horse. The journey alone was a punishment. He was stripped nearly naked, his back torn by the cobblestones, his skin smeared with mud and blood. Crowds lined the route, some jeering, some silent, some whispering prayers. To many English spectators, Wallace was a traitor, a savage who had brought war and terror to their lands. To the Scots forced to watch, he was a martyr in chains, his suffering proof of the price of defiance. When he reached Smithfield, the gallows loomed over the field like a monument to cruelty. The platform had been built tall enough for all to see, and the executioners, hardened men dressed in coarse linen and leather, were already in place. Beside them stood priests, sheriffs, and royal officials holding scrolls that detailed his crimes, treason, murder, rebellion against the crown. Wallace was dragged up onto the scaffold, his hands bound, his body trembling from exhaustion. Yet his head remained high. Witnesses later said that, even in that moment, he looked less like a criminal and more like a king who had lost his crown but not his dignity. The execution began with ritual humiliation. The royal herald stepped forward and read aloud Wallace's sentence. As the words, hanged, drawn, and quartered echoed through the crowd, the meaning became clear: this was no simple death. It was to be a slow disassembly of the man, a performance of power. The first act was hanging. A noose was looped around his neck, and the executioner pulled the rope tight. Wallace's body convulsed, his face turned purple, and for a moment it seemed the end had come. But the rope was cut before death could claim him. The crowd gasped as his limp body slumped to the ground, still breathing, barely conscious. The next act was mutilation. The executioner knelt beside him and, with a sharp knife, castrated him, an act as symbolic as it was cruel. The organs were held high for the crowd to see before being thrown into a small fire prepared nearby. The smell of burning flesh drifted over the square, and the noise of the crowd, once loud, dimmed into uneasy silence. Wallace was then disemboweled, the executioner slicing open his abdomen with deliberate precision. His intestines were pulled out slowly, inch by inch, and cast into the fire as he watched. Some said he remained conscious throughout, his lips moving in silent prayer. Others claimed he muttered words of defiance, invoking Scotland's freedom even as his life bled away. When at last he was near death, the executioner reached into his chest and cut out his heart, raising it before the crowd and shouting, "Behold the heart of a traitor." But to the Scots who had come in secret, risking their lives to watch, it was the heart of a hero. The brutality did not end with his death. The final act was dismemberment. His head was severed and dipped in tar to preserve it, then mounted on a pike above London Bridge. His body was cut into 4 quarters, one sent to Newcastle, another to Berwick, one to Stirling, and the last to Perth, each displayed publicly as a warning. To Edward, it was justice; to history, it was theatre. And yet, what the king had intended as a warning became something entirely different. The horror of Wallace's execution spread through England and Scotland alike, not as proof of royal might, but as evidence of tyranny. Chroniclers wrote that even some English spectators turned away in disgust, muttering that such cruelty dishonored the very law it sought to uphold. The silence that followed his death was not satisfaction, but shame. For the Scots, Wallace's death was not an end but a beginning. Word of his final moments, his courage, his endurance, carried north across the border, whispered in taverns and chapels, repeated in the fields and castles of a country still bleeding from war. He died praying for Scotland, people said. He died free. Whether true or not, the story became legend, growing larger with each retelling. Within a decade, Robert the Bruce would rise to lead a new rebellion, invoking Wallace's name as both battle cry and blessing. Even English chroniclers, bound by loyalty to the crown, could not ignore the impact of the spectacle. One described Wallace's face as noble even in torment, another admitted that his composure stirred pity even in those who hated him. Over time, these reluctant tributes helped transform a condemned traitor into a symbol of resistance, a man whose body had been scattered, but whose idea could not be killed. The method of his death, hanged, drawn, and quartered, would remain the ultimate punishment for treason in England for centuries. But with each repetition, its power diminished. The very excess of pain that had been meant to inspire obedience began instead to provoke reflection. Was such horror truly justice? Or was it proof that kings feared their subjects more than their enemies? Centuries later, artists and poets would return to Wallace's story as a mirror of moral endurance. Painters depicted his execution as a scene of martyrdom, writers transformed his suffering into poetry. In the 1995 film Braveheart, his cry of freedom, though apocryphal, captured the spirit of what his death had come to mean. History had turned brutality into inspiration, horror into heritage. Yet beyond myth and film lies the undeniable reality. William Wallace died in agony, his flesh torn and burned, his bones scattered across a divided land. His death was meant to crush hope. Instead, it carved his name into eternity. In that moment on the scaffold, under the grey London sky, the Empire believed it had silenced rebellion. But the flames that consumed his entrails lit a fire far more enduring, one that would burn in the hearts of generations. The very ritual meant to destroy him became the foundation of his immortality. When we remember Wallace today, we remember not the tools of his torture but the defiance that outlasted them. His execution stands as one of history's great paradoxes, proof that violence can never truly kill an idea. The sword, the rope, the fire, they destroyed his body, but they forged his legend. And in the end, the empire that had once scattered his remains would fall, while the name of William Wallace would remain forever bound to a single, unbreakable word: freedom. Florence, May 23, 1498. The Piazza della Signoria stood bathed in the golden light of a Tuscan morning, but there was nothing warm about the air that day. It was thick with tension, with whispers, with the uneasy excitement of a city about to witness the fall of its self-proclaimed prophet. At the center of the vast square, a wooden platform had been erected, part gallows, part pyre, rising above a sea of people. The banners of the Republic fluttered beside the insignia of the church. And bound in the middle of it all stood Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who had once ruled Florence not through sword or crown, but through the sheer force of his voice. For 4 years, Savonarola had dominated the city like no other. When the powerful Medici family was driven into exile, he had filled the vacuum with faith and fire, turning Florence, the cradle of Renaissance art and beauty, into a theocracy of fear. His sermons thundered against sin, vanity, and corruption. He had denounced the luxuries of the wealthy, the sensuality of art, the politics of the Pope. He promised that Florence would become the New Jerusalem, a city chosen by God to purify the world. And the people believed him. But belief is fragile. The same crowds that had once cheered him now gathered to see him die. They had grown weary of his tyranny disguised as virtue, his endless condemnations, his prophecies of doom. His enemies, both secular and sacred, had waited for this moment, and now it had come. The man who had burned books, paintings, and instruments of pleasure in his infamous bonfire of the vanities would himself burn upon a pyre of irony and judgment. As the bells of the Palazzo Vecchio tolled, Savonarola was led onto the scaffold, flanked by 2 of his closest followers, Fra Domenico de Pescia and Fra Silvestro Maruffi. All 3 wore simple white robes. Their heads were bowed, their faces pale but serene. Around them, soldiers kept back the swelling crowd. On the steps of the palazzo, a group of priests waited to perform the ritual of degradation, the ceremony by which a man was stripped of his holy office before execution. The chief inquisitor stepped forward, holding a silver cross. He intoned the words slowly, formally, as if reading from a script written by centuries of power. I separate thee from the church militant and from the church triumphant. Then he scraped the chrism, the sacred oil of ordination, from Savonarola's hands, erasing the mark of priesthood. It was a gesture both symbolic and cruel, the spiritual equivalent of flaying. Savonarola, who had once claimed to speak for God, was now officially declared abandoned by him. Witnesses said he did not resist. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, "The Lord has suffered as much for me." It was the voice of a man resigned to the will of the very power he had defied. The executioners worked quickly. The 3 friars were bound together by chains and lifted onto the gallows. Ropes were placed around their necks, their bodies positioned above the waiting fire. According to the plan, they were to be hanged first, to die by suffocation before the flames consumed them. But executions rarely obeyed plans. The ropes were old, the knots imperfect, the fire too eager. As the torches were set to the pyre, the wood caught instantly, dry and crackling. Flames leapt upward, licking the robes of the condemned before their breath had even left them. The crowd gasped as smoke billowed into the square, mingling with the smell of burning pitch and oil. Some shouted curses, others prayers. Savonarola's followers fell to their knees, weeping openly. A few fainted. The heat grew unbearable. Sparks floated through the air like fireflies, catching the edges of banners and cloaks. The bells of the city continued to toll, slow, relentless, echoing off the stone walls of the palazzo and the marble statues surrounding the square. The sound was not one of triumph but of requiem. Some witnesses claimed that as the flames rose higher, Savonarola's body seemed to stand upright, unbending, until the last moment. Others swore they saw his face illuminated through the smoke, peaceful, almost radiant, as if he had transcended pain. Whether miracle or illusion, it left an impression that would endure long after the ashes were swept away. When the fire finally died, there was little left. The executioners, under orders from the city council, gathered the ashes of all 3 friars and carried them to the Arno River. There, under the watchful eyes of the guards, they were scattered into the current to ensure that no relics could be preserved, no cult of martyrdom could arise. The water carried them away silently, mingling them forever with the lifeblood of the city he had once ruled. But Florence could not wash away what it had seen. The citizens returned to their homes in uneasy quiet, the echo of the flames still burning in their minds. For years afterward, they would debate whether Savonarola had been a false prophet or a holy man destroyed by corruption. To some, he was the voice of God's wrath, to others, the embodiment of fanaticism. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. In the years that followed, his name refused to fade. Painters like Fra Bartolomeo and Botticelli, who had once followed his sermons and thrown their works into the bonfire of the vanities, later painted visions of redemption inspired by his fall. Poets wrote of his courage and his madness, philosophers dissected his faith and his pride. Even Martin Luther, more than a century later, would speak of him as a martyr for truth, seeing in his defiance a precursor to the Reformation. Savonarola's death revealed a truth that would echo through history, that faith, when fused with power, becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. His Florence had been a city caught between heaven and earth, between the beauty of art and the fear of sin, between the Renaissance and the Inquisition. In trying to purify it, he had nearly destroyed it. Yet in destroying him, Florence had also condemned itself to memory. The fire that consumed his body would become a mirror in which Europe saw its own contradictions, faith and reason, holiness and cruelty, freedom and control. Centuries later, historians would stand in that same square, tracing the outlines of where the scaffold had stood. Tourists would pass, unaware that the cobblestones beneath their feet had once drunk the ashes of a man who tried to make heaven on earth. The Palazzo Vecchio still casts its long shadow over the piazza at sunset, and sometimes, when the wind blows from the river, locals swear they can smell faint smoke in the air. It is said that Florence never forgot that morning, not because of the horror, but because of what it revealed, that the pursuit of purity, unchecked by compassion, always ends in flames. And in that truth, Girolamo Savonarola lives on, not as a saint or a sinner, but as a warning written in fire, a lesson that even the most righteous cause, when consumed by certainty, can burn the world it seeks to save. Paris, May 27, 1610. The city awoke to the tolling of church bells, slow, deliberate, and heavy with sorrow. The news had spread faster than any messenger could ride. King Henry IV of France was dead, murdered in the streets by a fanatic's knife. In an instant, the man who had once been called Le Bon Roi Henri, the good King Henry, the monarch who had restored peace after decades of religious war, lay lifeless in his carriage. The assassin's name was François Ravaillac, and though his blade had ended one life, it had unleashed a storm of vengeance that would make his name forever synonymous with madness and cruelty. For days, Paris seemed suspended between grief and fury. The people mourned their king, the tolerant ruler who had once said that every peasant should have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. But as mourning turned to outrage, the mood of the city darkened. The royal court demanded an example so terrible that no one would ever again dare raise a hand against the crown. And so it was decreed, Ravaillac would face the full punishment for regicide, a sentence not only of death, but of total obliteration, both physical and spiritual. He was imprisoned in the conciergerie, where interrogations began immediately. The judges wanted names, conspirators, priests, secret enemies of the state, but Ravaillac had none to give. He insisted, even under torture, that he had acted alone, driven by divine inspiration. His words made his tormentors furious. They crushed his legs in the boots, iron frames tightened with wedges until bones splintered. They poured scalding oil over his wounds, yet still he confessed nothing. When he finally broke, it was not from pain but from exhaustion. "I killed the king," he whispered, "because he betrayed God." The court, disappointed by the lack of conspiracy, decided the execution itself would serve as the message. If Ravaillac's motives were divine in his mind, then his punishment would be infernal in every detail. On the morning of May 27, the execution square, Place de Grève, the same site that had seen Damien's agony half a century earlier, filled again with thousands. Nobles and merchants, monks and beggars, all came to witness what was promised to be the most exemplary punishment ever carried out in France. A scaffold had been built larger than any before, surrounded by guards and mounted soldiers to control the surging masses. The executioners, 6 in total, stood ready, their faces grim beneath the black hoods of their office. Ravaillac was brought forth at noon, pale and trembling but alive. His body bore the marks of weeks of torture, scars, burns, and bruises that covered him like a second skin. As he was led through the crowd, people spat and hurled insults, calling him, the butcher of the good king. But others, quieter and fewer, stared with something closer to horror than hate. There was no triumph in their eyes, only unease. The ceremony began with ritual precision. First, his right hand, the hand that had held the knife, was burned with sulfur and boiling pitch, the flames hissing as flesh blackened. Ravaillac screamed, but his voice was quickly lost in the roar of the crowd. The executioners then tore pieces of flesh from his arms and chest with red-hot pincers, dropping them onto the wooden planks where they hissed and smoked. The crowd, at first bloodthirsty, began to waver. The smell of burning skin, the sight of agony stretched beyond reason, it changed something in the air. Then came the final act. For powerful horses were brought to each corner of the scaffold, ropes tied to the prisoners' wrists and ankles. The crowd murmured, many remembered the failed quartering of Damiens, when even 4 horses could not tear the human body apart. This time, the executioners had prepared carefully, cutting the joints first to make the process swifter. At the signal, the drivers urged their horses forward. The ropes snapped taut, Ravaillac's body stretched, and then, a sound like thunder as the first limb gave way. The crowd gasped, some turned away, others fell to their knees. When it was over, what remained of the assassin's body was unrecognizable, a ruin of what had once been a man. His remains were gathered and thrown into a roaring fire, the ashes scattered into the wind. The square, moments earlier filled with screams, fell eerily silent. But the silence did not bring peace. Even those who had demanded vengeance left the scene shaken. One chronicler wrote that, the people went home with their hearts colder than before. The horror had not purified France, it had stained it. The execution intended to reaffirm royal power instead revealed its fragility. In the days that followed, debates erupted across Europe. Scholars, philosophers, and clergy wrote furious treatises. Some defended the execution as divine justice, others denounced it as barbarism. Among them was Michel de Montaigne's followers, humanists who saw in Ravaillac's death the moral corruption of an entire system, proof that the crown, in defending itself, had become the very thing it feared. Foreign ambassadors sent detailed reports to their monarchs. In Spain, one diplomat wrote, France has turned vengeance into art. In England, another observed, they have made the king immortal, but the kingdom smaller. Even within the French court, voices began to whisper that something had gone too far. What made the execution unforgettable was not just its cruelty, but its contradiction. Henry IV had been the king of compromise, the monarch who ended the wars of religion by declaring, Paris is worth a mass. His death had undone that fragile peace. And Ravaillac's punishment, instead of healing the wound, turned it into a scar. Over time, the story of Ravaillac's end became part of France's long reflection on the nature of justice and power. Philosophers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, would later cite it as an example of the barbarity of old regimes. Even those who believed in divine right began to question whether the hand of God truly guided such horrors. Yet, in its own grim way, the execution of Ravaillac accomplished something profound. It marked the final chapter of medieval punishment in France, the last time the body of a man would be publicly torn apart in the name of the state. Within decades, torture would be abolished as a legal practice, replaced by more humane methods like the guillotine, itself a paradox of mercy through efficiency. But the memory of that day lingered. Artists painted it in secret, philosophers dissected it in writing, and poets described it as the death that killed an age. To the common people, it became legend, the story of a man who murdered a king, only to be murdered by history itself. For centuries later, standing in the same square, it is difficult to imagine the spectacle that once took place there. Tourists walk across the cobblestones unaware that beneath their feet once ran the blood of a fanatic and the fear of a nation. The Seine flows quietly nearby, carrying reflections of bridges and lamplight instead of ash and fire. But the echoes remain, buried in the stones. Ravaillac believed he was acting for God. The state believed it was acting for justice. Both were wrong. What the world witnessed that May afternoon was not righteousness, but revelation, the moment when the illusion of divine power gave way to the fragile truth of human cruelty. The sun set over Paris that evening in silence. The crowd dispersed, the fires burned low, and the last embers drifted into the twilight. History closed its book on Ravaillac, but the lesson it wrote in the margins has never faded. When power seeks to prove its divinity through pain, it becomes the very evil it claims to destroy. Through the centuries, the 8 executions that shocked the world, from Hugh Despenser's agony in medieval London to François Raveillac's final moments in Paris, became more than isolated horrors. They were mirrors reflecting humanity's darkest obsession, the desire to transform punishment into spectacle. The story of these deaths is not merely about cruelty or the condemned, it is about the systems that orchestrated suffering as performance, and the societies that gathered, by the thousands, to watch. In every era, public executions carried a meaning beyond justice. They were rituals of power, the state reminding its subjects who ruled life and death. Monarchs, emperors, popes, and judges all understood the theater of punishment. The scaffold was not simply a place of execution, it was a stage where authority displayed its supremacy through pain, where moral order was reaffirmed through the destruction of a body. Yet, paradoxically, these same displays often betrayed the fragility of that very power. The death of Hugh Despenser in 1326, torn apart before a horrified English crowd, was meant to cleanse a kingdom of corruption. Instead, it exposed the savagery beneath royal justice. His torment marked the dawn of a ritualized cruelty that would echo for centuries, in the drawing and quartering of traitors, in the fires that consumed heretics, in the boiling cauldrons of Tudor fear. The pattern was clear: when rulers felt threatened, punishment became theater, and pain became politics. China's Ling Chi, or Death by 1,000 Cuts, revealed this same truth from another side of the world. It was not passion or chaos, but order and bureaucracy that defined it, the cold efficiency of a system that turned agony into arithmetic. Each cut had its place, its rule, its purpose. This was cruelty disguised as law, proof that civilization and savagery could coexist within the same empire. When Western observers recoiled in horror, they failed to recognize their own history mirrored back at them. Europe had its own 1,000 cuts, delivered by rope, by flame, by blade, all justified by the same reasoning: control. By the 16th century, as faith and politics intertwined across Europe, the theater of punishment grew even more elaborate. Richard Rouse's boiling at Smithfield became a new kind of warning, one not just against crime, but against disobedience itself. The crowd came expecting spectacle, but what they saw instead was too much truth. The smell, the sound, the unbearable slowness, it turned entertainment into nausea. In that moment, the people glimpsed the abyss between justice and cruelty. When the law was repealed 16 years later, it was as if England itself had flinched. France learned the same lesson through Robert-François Damiens and François Ravaillac. Their executions were intended to glorify kingship, to demonstrate divine power on earth. Instead, they revealed its decay. The philosopher Voltaire would later write that, the punishment of Damiens taught more than the death of 1,000 traitors, because it showed that torture, rather than upholding order, corrupted it. The monarchy, in displaying absolute power, had displayed absolute inhumanity, and in doing so, signed its own death warrant. Even the story of Marcus, the satyr of myth flayed for defying Apollo, carried a lesson that outlived the empire that told it. His torment was a warning against hubris, against challenging the gods, but it was also a metaphor for exposure. To be flayed alive was to be stripped of every layer of pretense, reduced to pure vulnerability. Roman artists immortalized the image, not because they admired the cruelty, but because they were fascinated by what it revealed, that the line between punishment and art, between divine retribution and human curiosity, was perilously thin. When William Wallace was executed in 1305, his death too was meant to be an ending. Instead, it became a beginning, a rallying cry for independence that outlasted empires. His defiance on the scaffold transformed him from rebel to legend. History remembers not the executioner, but the man who refused to beg. Across nations and centuries, the same pattern repeated: the greater the cruelty of the punishment, the stronger the myth of the punished. Power tried to erase rebellion through spectacle, but it only engraved it deeper into memory. Girolamo Savonarola's execution in Florence was no different. Burned in the same square where he once burned the vanities of others, his death completed a perfect circle of irony. Yet even as his body turned to ash, his ideas, purity, reform, and divine purpose, lived on. Florence wept and argued in equal measure. Was he a prophet or a tyrant? A saint or a madman? The answer, perhaps, was irrelevant. His death revealed that conviction itself, when weaponized, could become the cruelest fire of all. By the time of François Ravaillac, the ritual of public execution had reached its breaking point. The spectacle that had once unified crowds in faith now divided them in doubt. The Enlightenment was dawning, and philosophers began to ask whether terror truly made societies moral, or merely obedient. Ravaillac's execution, with all its orchestrated horror, became the last echo of an age that was dying. The guillotine, efficient and impersonal, would soon replace the stage of pain with the machinery of death. In its cold blade lay the final transformation, from spectacle to system, from agony to instant oblivion. But even that change could not erase the memory of what came before. The stories of these 8 deaths endure because they force us to confront a truth we prefer to forget: humanity has always been fascinated by its own darkness. The crowd that once gathered in Smithfield or the Place de Grève has not vanished, it has simply moved online, into the theaters of modern media, where tragedy and fascination still coexist. The instinct that drove people to watch others die for justice has become the same instinct that makes us replay disaster footage, true crime confessions, or sensational trials. We no longer stand in the square, but we still watch the scaffold. The difference now lies in awareness. Where once cruelty was celebrated as virtue, today it is studied as warning. Historians, filmmakers, and educators retell these stories not to glorify pain, but to understand how societies could mistake it for justice. The suffering of the condemned becomes, in retrospect, the suffering of everyone who believed such acts necessary. In the end, these 8 executions mark milestones in the evolution of moral consciousness. Each represents a society confronting its own limits, and crossing them. Dispenser's disembowelment, Lynch's endless precision, Ruse's boiling, Damien's quartering, Wallace's martyrdom, Savonarola's burning, Ravaillac's dismemberment, all were intended to enforce obedience, but instead provoked reflection. They forced humanity to ask a question that echoes through every courtroom, every war, every debate about punishment: what do we become when we inflict suffering in the name of order? The crowds that once vomited and fainted at the sight of pain were not weak, they were witnessing the moment when fear turned to conscience. Their disgust was the beginning of change. That change would take centuries, through revolutions and reforms, through the slow recognition that power must justify itself not by how it punishes, but by how it preserves dignity. As dusk falls on this story, imagine the empty scaffolds, the silent squares, the smoke rising into the night. The echoes of screams have faded, but their meaning remains. These places of death became places of reckoning. The cruelty that once defined authority now defines its failure. The memory of those 8 deaths reminds us that justice cannot be built upon spectacle, and that every society must decide, again and again, whether it wishes to rule through fear, or to evolve through compassion. History's verdict is clear: power enforced through pain is never eternal. Empires fall, kings die, and even the instruments of torture rust away. But the lesson endures, whispered by the stones that once drank the blood of the condemned, that true strength is not found in domination, but in restraint. For every age that forgets this truth, the past stands ready to remind it, with echoes that still chill the soul. As the story draws to its close, the camera slowly pans across the empty square, the same square that once echoed with the screams and cheers of thousands. Now, only silence remains. The scaffold, once a symbol of terror, is nothing more than an artifact, softened by time and covered in ivy. The stones beneath it have absorbed centuries of footsteps, centuries of change. And in that silence, one question lingers: what have we learned from our own cruelty? Human history is not just a record of wars and kings, it is also the story of how we learned, painfully and imperfectly, to recognize suffering. Each act of brutality, each death that made the crowd recoil, marked a turning point in that moral awakening. What began as public entertainment evolved, through revulsion and empathy, into reflection and conscience. The executions of Despenser, Roos, Wallace, Savonarola, Ravaillac, and so many others became unintentional lessons, moments where civilization glimpsed the horror of its own reflection. By the 18th century, philosophers began to question the idea that pain could purify the soul or protect society. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy and Voltaire in France argued that justice must be rational, not vengeful, that punishment should serve reform, not spectacle. Their writings planted the seeds of a revolution that would sweep away centuries of sanctioned cruelty. When the guillotine arrived, it was hailed as a symbol of progress, swift, equal, and humane. It was, paradoxically, the machine that ended the theater of pain. But even then, humanity's fascination with suffering never truly vanished. The scaffold simply moved from the square to the screen. Where once people gathered to watch flesh and fire, they now gather to watch stories, dramatized, reenacted, reimagined. The human impulse to stare into darkness persists, but today, it serves a new purpose: understanding rather than celebration. Every retelling of these ancient horrors is, in some way, an act of remembrance. We tell these stories not to glorify them, but to ensure that they never return. They remind us of how fragile civilization can be, how quickly morality bends when fear or authority demands it. In Despenser's execution, we see revenge dressed as law. In Wallace's death, patriotism twisted into cruelty. In Savonarola's burning, faith turned against itself. And in Ravaillac's torment, justice consumed by vengeance. What binds these stories together is not the violence itself, but the realization that every empire, every kingdom, every regime that relied on cruelty eventually fell. Their instruments of fear, the gallows, the rack, the flames, became their monuments of failure. The crowd's vomit, the silence that followed the screams, the turning away of faces, all were signs of awakening. Humanity was learning, in real time, that suffering could no longer be the foundation of order. When we look at these events from a modern perspective, it's easy to feel superior, to believe that we have evolved beyond such barbarity. But cruelty never disappears, it only changes form. It hides behind policies, screens, and indifference. The difference now is awareness, the ability to recognize it, to name it, and to resist it. The moral progress that began in those medieval squares continues every time we choose compassion over spectacle, justice over revenge. The story of public execution is ultimately a story of transformation. It is the journey from fear to conscience, from dominance to empathy. Once, rulers proved their power by breaking bodies; today, societies prove their strength by protecting them. Yet, the shadow of the past remains, a warning carved into history's memory. Every society must decide how much cruelty it is willing to accept in the name of order. Every generation must look into that mirror and answer the same question: how much suffering are we willing to watch before we change? In that sense, the scaffold is not gone, it has become symbolic. It exists wherever people turn pain into spectacle, whether in the Colosseums of Rome, the execution squares of Paris, or the virtual platforms of the modern age. The faces have changed, but the moral test remains the same. Do we watch with empathy, or with curiosity? Do we seek understanding, or entertainment? History has shown what happens when fascination outweighs compassion. And yet, there is hope. The very fact that these stories now make us uncomfortable, that they disturb, horrify, or move us to tears, proves that humanity has evolved. The same species that once gathered to cheer a man's disembowelment now teaches that same history as a warning, not a triumph. The transformation is imperfect, but it is real. Each generation adds its own layer to that evolution, building slowly toward a more humane understanding of justice. When philosophers like Michel Foucault revisited these punishments centuries later, they did not do so to relive their horror, but to reveal their meaning. Foucault's insight was simple yet profound: the spectacle of punishment was never just about the condemned, it was about everyone watching. Power needed witnesses. The state's authority depended on the public's complicity. And when the public began to turn away, to feel sick, to doubt, to reject, the system itself began to crumble. The end of public execution was not a royal decree, it was a moral evolution. Now, as we stand in the present, looking back through the centuries, we can trace that evolution in our own reflection. We no longer display bodies, we display ideas. We no longer burn heretics, we debate them. Justice is no longer a performance of fear but a conversation about fairness. And yet, the lesson remains fragile. It depends on memory, on remembering the cost of forgetting. Imagine again that silent square at twilight. The scaffold stands, covered in ivy. The sun dips below the rooftops, bathing the stones in gold. A child walks past, holding her mother's hand, pointing curiously at the wooden structure. "What is that?" she asks. The mother pauses for a moment before answering, softly, "That's what we used to call justice." The camera rises slowly, pulling back until the square becomes part of a vast cityscape, old and new, past and present blending together. The distant hum of life replaces the silence. The world has moved on, but the memory remains, etched in every stone. The narrator's final words echo gently over the image. Cruelty built empires, but compassion sustains humanity. The crowd that once cheered has learned to weep, and in that weeping, found redemption. History's greatest transformation was not in how we died, but in how we learned to live. The screen fades to black. The music swells, a slow, haunting melody that resolves into something tender and hopeful. The title appears. 8 Deaths That Changed Humanity, From Suffering to Conscience. And as the final note fades, a single line appears beneath it, illuminated against the darkness. Remember not the cruelty, but the courage to end it. Begins not with horror but with silence, the kind of silence that follows when history finally exhales. The echoes of centuries fade into distance, replaced by something gentler, understanding. Humanity, at last, has stepped away from the scaffold, the stake, the pyre. But the question that lingers is deeper than the end of cruelty, it is whether we have truly learned from it. The story of these 8 deaths, and the millions that followed them, is not simply about punishment or pain. It is a mirror reflecting our evolution from fear to empathy, from spectacle to conscience. When we look into that mirror, we see not only what we were, but what we still might become. Each generation believes itself more enlightened than the last, yet the same shadows remain, disguised, redefined, modernized. The medieval square has given way to the digital arena, the torchlight replaced by camera flashes. But the fascination with suffering, the hunger for retribution, the allure of judgment, they have not disappeared. They have only changed form. In the past, the scaffold was built in the town square. Today, it exists in the global square of screens. We no longer gather to watch bodies burn, but we still gather, in millions, to watch reputations destroyed, to witness humiliation disguised as justice. The language has softened, the instruments are invisible, but the mechanism remains. When society forgets compassion, when anger becomes entertainment, the spirit of the old square lives again. That is why remembrance matters. These stories, Dispenser, Ling Chi, Ruse, Wallace, Savonarola, Ravaillac, are not relics, they are warnings. They show us what happens when power loses humility and when justice loses its soul. Each execution began with a justification. Every crowd believed they were defending morality, law, or faith. None imagined they were witnessing barbarity. History's greatest atrocities were committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people convinced they were righteous. The moment we believe cruelty is necessary, we risk repeating their mistakes. And yet, hope persists. Humanity's moral progress is not a straight line but a spiral. We return to the same questions: but from higher ground. In the 18th century, thinkers like Beccaria and Voltaire planted seeds of mercy. In the 19th, reformers abolished torture. In the 20th, humanity confronted its capacity for destruction and codified human rights. The 21st century faces a different battlefield, one fought not in chains and fire, but in hearts and minds. Our challenge is not to end cruelty, it is to recognize it when it hides behind policy, profit, or indifference. Justice, in its truest form, is not the infliction of pain, but the prevention of it. It is not about balancing suffering, but breaking its cycle. The lesson of history's cruelty is that punishment without empathy breeds more cruelty, while mercy can transform even the darkest legacy into understanding. A society's greatness is not measured by how it destroys the guilty, but by how it redeems the fallen and protects the innocent. Imagine, for a moment, the ghosts of those 8 condemned figures standing in that empty square, not in agony, but in peace. Their voices no longer scream, they whisper. Hugh Dispenser speaks of pride and betrayal, of power's corruption. The Chinese prisoner of Lingqi warns of cruelty hidden behind order. Richard Roos reminds us of justice twisted by fear. William Wallace stands silent, his endurance echoing louder than his pain. Savonarola reflects on faith consumed by fanaticism. Ravaillac, whose madness became a nation's spectacle, looks down in regret. Together, their presence is not an accusation but an appeal, to remember, to evolve, to choose differently. The true ending of this story is not death, but awareness. Humanity's journey from the square to the courtroom, from the executioner's blade to the gavel, marks the slow awakening of conscience. Laws changed because hearts did. Once, people watched others die and called it justice, now, many watch such history and call it tragedy. That is progress, imperfect, fragile, but real. And still, the test continues. When we scroll through headlines of violence, when we see injustice and look away, when we delight in another's downfall, we stand once again in that ancient square. The crowd's faces have changed, but the moral choice remains the same, to watch or to walk away, to condemn or to understand. The future depends not on whether cruelty exists, it always will, but on whether compassion speaks louder than the crowd's roar. There will always be those who justify harshness in the name of order, who argue that pain corrects, that fear preserves peace. History offers its silent rebuttal, fear only delays collapse, cruelty only deepens division. The endurance of civilization rests on empathy, not as weakness, but as strength. Mercy requires courage, understanding requires wisdom. Every age that forgets this truth builds its own scaffold, not from wood and rope, but from hate and indifference. And yet, light endures. Humanity has learned to remember, to turn horror into history, tragedy into teaching. Museums preserve the tools once used for torture, not as trophies, but as warnings. Books, films, and art retell these stories so that the dead might still speak. Every generation that listens ensures that cruelty loses a little more of its power. As twilight deepens over that symbolic square, the scaffold fades into shadow. The last torch flickers out, replaced by the soft glow of lanterns in the windows of a modern city. The world has changed, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to matter. The camera lingers on the mother and child crossing the square. The child asks, "What happened here?" The mother answers, "Once, people thought pain was justice." The child looks puzzled. "And now?" The mother smiles softly. "Now we try to understand." The wind moves through the ivy, carrying away the last traces of the past. Doves rise into the sky, their wings glowing gold in the evening sun. The scene widens, revealing a world both ancient and new, one that has walked through darkness and, though still imperfect, now seeks light. The narrator's voice returns one final time. Cruelty once defined power. Now compassion defines progress. We can't change the pain that built our past, but we can choose what builds our future. Every act of mercy, every moment of understanding, every refusal to dehumanize, these are the quiet revolutions that move humanity forward. As the music swells, the camera tilts upward toward the sky, clouds drifting across a soft gradient of gold and blue. The words appear on screen, simple and unadorned. The lesson of history is not that we were cruel, but that we can change. Fade to black. The end.